Earth appeared insignificant from orbit, a small, blue dot in the vastness of space, hardly worth a second glance. Yet to the Vathi, it was a necessary conquest, strategically placed on a galactic trade route. The warriors, tall and armored in sleek, bioengineered suits, stood on the bridge of their flagship. Their commander, a scarred and imposing figure, stared down at the planet with cold eyes. "The humans call it Earth," she mused, her voice laced with amusement. "A primitive world. No real defenses to speak of." Her lieutenants exchanged glances, barely suppressing their laughter. These humans were weak, after all. Their technology was laughably outdated, their civilization fragile. "Send in the fleets. Begin the conquest. No resistance is expected," she ordered, turning away. Massive ships descended through the clouds, moving silently across the skies. They activated cloaking fields as they neared the surface, rendering them invisible to human eyes and technology. The Vathi relished the ease of it all. Their energy weapons obliterated Earth's satellites in moments, leaving the planet blind and cut off. Global communications went dark as power grids and military installations crumbled under the weight of their assault. The commander watched as entire cities fell silent, their infrastructure dismantled with cold precision. She smirked, her lips curving into a smile. "Pathetic," she muttered. "Not even a challenge." A junior officer, scanning the human networks they'd infiltrated, reported with a bored tone. "The males here are especially weak. They lack discipline, unlike their female counterparts." The commander chuckled. "Typical. Males are a liability in any species." She turned to her second-in-command, a seasoned warrior who had fought in dozens of campaigns. "Capture some of them. We may as well learn what makes these humans tick. Perhaps we can find some amusement before we crush them entirely." The ships spread out, scanning the surface for survivors. Pockets of resistance formed briefly but were swiftly extinguished. Earth's military, proud in its limited scope, fought valiantly but in vain. Their tanks and jets were obsolete in the face of Valathi's precision. Human weapons exploded in bursts of light, utterly ineffective against the advanced alien armor. Earth was no more than a tactical victory to the Valathi, over before it even began. "Is this all they can muster?" one of the warriors scoffed as they breached another city. "We'll be done here by sunset." The Valathi's bioarmor, impenetrable and powered by their collective psychic abilities, rendered human soldiers useless. They moved through the debris like ghosts, untouchable and unstoppable, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. The commander, overseeing the entire operation, shook her head. "They don't even understand what's happening to them. They still think they can win." She turned to her lieutenant. "Round up some of the males for study. I want to see what kind of creature could build such a pitiful society." As the warriors fanned out, they gathered human captives with ease, herding them like cattle. There was no fight left in them. Cities had fallen in hours, and the remaining population was in disarray. The Valathi, ever confident in their superiority, laughed at the thought of any human resistance. One warrior looked down at her scanner, noting a faint signal deep in the wilderness, far from the city's ruins. "A male," she reported. "Isolated. Likely a straggler." The commander raised an eyebrow. "Bring him in. Let's see if he's as useless as the rest." And so, the Valathi swept through the forests, their sensors attuned to every movement, every heartbeat. The humans were weak. Earth was theirs. But as they closed in on their target, the commander's amusement flickered for the briefest moment. She could not explain it, but something about this hunt, this man, felt different. Yet she shrugged it off. It didn't matter. No human, no male, could possibly pose a threat to the Valathi. After all, they were the pinnacle of evolution, and this was merely another conquest. As the warriors prepared to capture their next specimen, they had no idea that their assumptions about humanity were about to be tested in ways they never expected. Jacob crouched low, hidden beneath the thick underbrush. His breath was steady, his movements precise. Years of surviving in the wilderness had taught him patience, and now, that patience was paying off. The sounds of the Valathai drones moving overhead were distant, but unmistakable. They were hunting. He'd been watching them for hours, cold, efficient, and seemingly infallible. They didn't care about the terrain, didn't care about subtlety. Why would they? They had technology that outclassed anything Earth had ever dreamed of. But Jacob knew something they didn't. Nature didn't care about technology. The Valathai found him before he found them. One moment he was alone in the woods, and the next, towering figures in sleek bioarmor appeared out of nowhere. Their weapons glowed faintly, their movements graceful but deadly. They didn't hesitate. A beam of light hit him, paralyzing his muscles instantly. He could do nothing as they surrounded him, speaking in a language that buzzed in his ears like static. Pathetic, one of them muttered in a language he understood. This is what they send to survive. Their voices held no malice, only indifference, as if they were commenting on the weather. They lifted him with ease, carrying him back to their ship like one might haul a sack of supplies. Jacob didn't struggle. He didn't even blink. Instead, he studied their movements, their technology. His mind worked faster than his body could respond, cataloging details, observing weaknesses. On board their ship, he was dropped unceremoniously in a stark, metallic room. The Valathai stood around him, tall and imposing, their expressions unreadable beneath their masks. One stepped forward, clearly the leader. Her armor was more ornate, her presence commanding. This is the best your world can offer. Her voice was like steel scraping against stone, and yet, there was an undeniable sense of superiority. She looked him up and down, her eyes narrowing. A male, no less. Weak. Primitive. Emotionally driven. Jacob didn't flinch. He remained silent, watching, listening. You're nothing more than animals playing at civilization, she continued, circling him slowly. Your kind will fall easily, just as all the others have. You rely on instinct and sentimentality. We rely on logic and strength. He knew she expected a reaction. Anger, fear, maybe even desperation. But Jacob gave her nothing. Instead, his mind worked quietly, registering the small but important details. The subtle flicker in her armor's energy field as she moved. The way her soldiers stood slightly behind her, always watching her for cues. They were united, sure, but they followed her lead. And that, he realized, was a vulnerability. You don't even understand what's happening to you, do you? She asked, almost pitying him now. Your world is already ours, your people already defeated. Jacob met her gaze, his expression calm, almost detached. Maybe, he said finally. His voice was steady, controlled. But you don't know this world as well as you think you do. Her eyes narrowed, the faintest flicker of irritation crossing her face. We know enough. Your primitive weapons are useless. Your cities are in ruins. We've broken your communication lines, disabled your defenses. What could you possibly do? Jacob allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile. You've underestimated us. She laughed, a harsh, metallic sound that echoed off the walls. Underestimated you? You're nothing. A species on the verge of extinction, clinging to outdated ideas of strength. This is the natural order of things. Jacob shrugged slightly, leaning back against the cold metal wall. Maybe. Or maybe you've been so focused on what we don't have that you missed what we do. The commander tilted her head, her curiosity piqued for the first time. And what would that be, human? What could possibly make you think you can stand against the Valathai? Adaptability, he said simply. She scoffed. Adaptability? You think that will save you? It already has. Jacob's eyes flicked to a small, barely visible gap in the ceiling above, a vent he noticed when they first brought him in. He didn't need much. Just one chance. The commander didn't notice his glance. She was too busy dismissing his words, too confident in her superiority. You're delaying the inevitable. You will tell us what we want to know about your people, your defenses, what little remains of them. And then you will be discarded. Jacob remained still, his breathing even. Let them think what they wanted. He had time. He'd been underestimated before, and he'd survived. This wasn't much different. The interrogation continued, but Jacob gave them nothing. Every insult, every threat, every attempt to probe his mind with their psychic abilities was met with the same calm indifference. They assumed it was because he was weak, broken even. In truth, he was simply waiting for the right moment. The Vathi, for all their strength and intelligence, were arrogant. They believed they had already won, and that arrogance blinded them. They overlooked the smallest details, the very things Jacob relied on for survival. The subtle shifts in air pressure, the way their technology hummed at different frequencies depending on its function, the vulnerability in their energy fields when they moved. He wouldn't be able to overpower them physically. He knew that. But he didn't need to. He just needed a crack in their armor, a single oversight. As the commander left the room, convinced that Jacob was no threat, he allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. They had no idea. Their cold logic and strength had blinded them to the reality of this planet, to what its people were capable of. Jacob wasn't just surviving. He was planning. And soon, the Vathi would realize that underestimating a human might be their biggest mistake yet. Jacob's escape wasn't a single act of bravery, but a series of calculated moves. He waited until the night shift aboard the Vathi ship, when the guards were fewer and the alien arrogance was at its peak. They believed him to be no threat, a lone human male with no real means of resistance. They didn't realize that his mind had been working nonstop, finding weak points in their systems, understanding the layout of their ship, and timing their routines. When the time came, he feigned exhaustion, slumping against the wall of his cell. The guard on duty, barely paying attention, glanced at him with the same disdain they all had. That was the moment he'd been waiting for. With a sudden burst of energy, Jacob triggered a small mechanical device he had quietly fashioned from scavenged components, something simple but effective. It created a brief short circuit in the energy field of his cell, just enough to disrupt it. He slipped out silently, moving through the dimly lit corridors with the precision of a hunter. His knowledge of Earth's forests and wildlife translated surprisingly well in the alien ship. He knew how to move quietly, how to blend into the shadows. By the time they realized he was gone, Jacob had already made his way into the lower decks, where he disabled a few key systems to create confusion. He slipped out into the night, vanishing into the dense forest near the landing site. The Vathi, for all their advanced technology, had no real understanding of Earth's wilderness. Their sensors picked up heat signatures and movement, but Jacob was careful, staying low and using the terrain to his advantage. He moved like a ghost, covering his tracks and disappearing into the landscape. They followed, but the deeper they went, the more disoriented they became. Their tech wasn't built for this kind of terrain. The thick foliage, the unpredictable wildlife, it all worked against them. Jacob used every inch of his knowledge to stay one step ahead. He set traps, using nothing but local materials, primitive, by their standards, but devastatingly effective. He knew which plants were poisonous, which animals were territorial, and how to lure the Vathi into vulnerable positions. They may have had energy shields and advanced armor, but they weren't prepared for the chaos that nature could unleash. One of his traps was a simple deadfall, a large section of a hillside that he destabilized using basic tools and his understanding of the terrain. When the Vathi squad moved through the area, the ground beneath them shifted, sending tons of dirt and rock cascading down. Their energy fields flickered as they tried to stabilize themselves, but it was too late. The landslide buried 2 of them, while the rest scrambled for safety. Jacob watched from a distance, waiting for the confusion to set in. The Vathi were used to clean, controlled environments. The wilderness was a mess they couldn't predict or control. He played on that, using psychological tactics as much as physical ones. He left signs of his presence, only to disappear again, making them second-guess their every move. They began to split up, trying to cover more ground, and that's when they became even more vulnerable. The Vathi commander, who had once seen Jacob as nothing more than a joke, was starting to feel the weight of his actions. Reports from the field were disjointed. Their advanced tracking systems were malfunctioning in the dense forest, their soldiers were nervous, and their technology wasn't responding the way it should in Earth's chaotic environment. She had underestimated him, and worse, she had underestimated Earth itself. Jacob, meanwhile, was relentless. He found one of their smaller communication hubs, a sleek tower hidden in the woods, and dismantled it in a matter of hours. He didn't destroy it outright, he wanted to send a message. Instead, he rigged the wiring to create a cascade failure, setting off a chain reaction that fried the circuits throughout the system. When the Vathi tried to restore power, the whole thing went dark. By now, the Vathi warriors had begun to see Jacob not as a primitive, but as a threat. Their arrogance was crumbling, replaced by frustration and confusion. They couldn't understand how one man, with no advanced technology, could be causing them so much trouble. They increased their patrols, doubling down on their efforts to capture him, but every step they took only led them deeper into the wilderness, where Jacob had the upper hand. At night, Jacob would move closer to their camp, leaving signs that he'd been watching them, footprints near their sentry posts, small marks on their equipment, subtle but enough to unsettle them. They were starting to realize that they were no longer the hunters. He was in control of this terrain, and they were intruders. Their reliance on technology, once their greatest strength, was now their weakness. The commander, growing more frustrated with each passing day, ordered an all-out search, but it was clear that they were grasping at straws. Jacob knew the terrain too well, and more importantly, he knew how to make them doubt themselves. He didn't need to engage them directly. He just needed to keep them off balance, to make them question their every move. In one key moment, Jacob sabotaged a Vathi transport ship, cutting its fuel line and rerouting its navigation system to send it into a dense thicket of trees. The ship's crew barely escaped before it crashed, and the event sent a ripple of fear through the Vathi ranks. Their ships, their armor, their weapons, it was all useless if they didn't understand the world they were fighting in. The commander, once so sure of her victory, now stood on the edge of doubt. She had underestimated this human, underestimated his world. And now, with each passing day, Jacob was proving that Earth's greatest strength wasn't its technology, but its ability to adapt, to fight in ways the Vathi could never anticipate. Jacob wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was a threat, a force they couldn't predict, and more importantly, couldn't stop. And as the days wore on, the Vathi began to realize that the man they had once dismissed as weak and insignificant might be the very thing that undid their invasion. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. Jacob could feel the tension in the air, knowing this was the end game. He'd been on the run for days, constantly staying ahead of the Vathi, but something had changed. The relentless pursuit had stopped, and now, it felt like they were letting him be found. He stood on a ridge overlooking a valley, watching as a single Vathi ship descended. The sleek, dark vessel landed silently in the clearing below. He knew it wasn't an ambush. If they had wanted to take him by force, they would have done it by now. No, this was something different. The ramp lowered, and the commander emerged, her armor gleaming in the afternoon light. She walked alone, her posture less rigid than before. This wasn't the overconfident warrior who had dismissed him in the interrogation room. This was someone with questions, someone who had been humbled. Jacob didn't move as she approached. His eyes stayed focused on her, but he didn't reach for the knife at his belt. He sensed this wasn't a fight. Not anymore. "You've led us on quite a chase," she said, her tone almost conversational, though still carrying an edge of command. "I could have sent my forces to bring you in. Yet here I am." Jacob raised an eyebrow, still cautious. "You came all this way just to talk?" The commander stopped a few paces from him, her helmet retracting to reveal her face for the first time. Her features were sharp, regal, and undeniably alien, but her expression was calm, almost curious. "Yes," she said. "I've come to understand something about your people. And about you." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jacob stayed silent, waiting for her to continue. "When we first arrived," she began, "we believed your kind to be weak, inferior, unworthy of real consideration. Our mission was simple: conquer, extract resources, and leave. But you've shown me something I hadn't expected. Jacob didn't respond immediately. He knew there was more to this than just words of respect. What's that? Adaptability, she said, folding her arms. Cunning. Resilience. Qualities that don't show up on a scan, but they've proved to be more dangerous than we anticipated. He shrugged slightly. Earth's always been about survival. We just don't give up easily. The commander's lips curved into a slight smile, an expression of amusement, perhaps, or recognition. That much is clear. Your tactics. They've humbled some of my best soldiers. They weren't prepared for a battle that wasn't fought with lasers and ships. Jacob met her gaze evenly. You underestimated us. She nodded, the admission coming without hesitation. Yes. I did. There was a pause, and then she added, I don't make that mistake twice. The air between them shifted. What started as a confrontation now felt like the beginning of something else. So what now? Jacob asked, his voice measured. You here to make an offer? Her eyes flickered with a hint of challenge. You're sharp. I like that about you. Yes, I'm here to offer you something. An alliance. He blinked, the word catching him off guard. An alliance? The commander's gaze was steady. You've shown me that humans are more than we thought. Stronger, in ways we didn't understand. I believe that together, our strengths could be complementary. Jacob stayed silent for a moment, turning the idea over in his head. His instincts told him to be cautious, but there was something genuine in her offer. He could sense it. You're serious? Very, she replied. Your ability to think on your feet, to use the environment to your advantage, to strategize with limited resources, it's a skill we don't often encounter. It's valuable. We could use someone like you. He studied her face, trying to find any hint of deception. But she seemed sincere. And what do we get out of this alliance? She tilted her head slightly. We will leave your planet. Not as conquerors, but as allies. In exchange, we offer our technology, our knowledge. We could elevate your world in ways you haven't even imagined. But more importantly, we offer peace. Jacob let out a slow breath. And if I refuse? Her expression didn't change. We leave, regardless. We've learned enough to know this invasion won't go as planned. But I'd rather we left on better terms. She stepped closer, her voice lowering. This isn't just about Earth. You've earned our respect, Jacob. I'm offering you a place among us. He frowned. Among the Vathi? She nodded. Yes. As an advisor, a strategist. Your skills are rare, even among my people. I see potential in you. Jacob hadn't expected this. Not after everything that had happened. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. The Vathi were powerful, but their strength was in technology and brute force. They lacked the kind of ingenuity that humans had been forced to develop over millennia. Maybe there was something to this alliance. Something that could benefit both sides. He glanced at the ship behind her, then back at her. You're asking me to trust you. I am, she said, her voice steady. And in return, I'll trust you. I don't offer this lightly. Jacob hesitated for a moment longer. He had no reason to trust her, not after what they'd done, but something told him this was real. This wasn't just about him, or even Earth. It was about the future. A future that could be shaped by cooperation instead of conflict. Finally, he nodded. All right, he said. I'll join you. But on one condition. The commander raised an eyebrow. And what's that? You keep your word, Jacob said firmly. No more invasions. No more threats. If we're going to do this, it has to be as equals. She regarded him for a long moment, then inclined her head. Agreed. With that, the tension seemed to dissolve. The commander extended her hand, a gesture that felt surprisingly human. Jacob clasped it, sealing the deal. It felt strange, shaking hands with someone who had once been his enemy, but it also felt right. As they walked toward the ship, the future ahead felt uncertain but hopeful. The Vathi would leave Earth, not as victors, but as partners. And Jacob would go with them, stepping into a new world he never could have imagined. In the end, humanity's greatest victory wasn't in defeating the Vathi, but in earning their respect. Jacob had shown them what humans were capable of, and now, the future of both species would be shaped by that understanding. An unexpected alliance had been formed, and Jacob's journey was just beginning.